This is my mother, and this is her in the 1970s. You can see here, this is one of my favorite pictures of her. She's wearing a nice hat and white gloves, and I remember being young and seeing this photo and thinking, wow, I'm so proud of her. She's so cool. She is cool. She worked for Cathay Pacific Airlines in the 1970s. You can see the aircraft here. She lived in Hong Kong. Although she's Japanese, she moved to Hong Kong in the early 1970s to work, which is where she met my dad. Now, you're allowed to take out your phones at this moment and do some Googling if you're not hanging out on your phones already, and notice the number, or the letters on the tail of the aircraft, VRHFZ. Now, I found out about this about a week ago, and that is, in 1972, this particular aircraft took off from Singapore and flew over Vietnam, and there was an explosion on board. And it killed all 81 people on board, including the crew. And the story goes, and it's still not quite sure what happened, but there was a police officer who's the culprit. And he took out insurance policies on his fiancée and his daughter who were on board the aircraft. Now, as I said, I only found out about this last week. And what I also found out was that on that day in 1972, my mom was on standby. And she wasn't called to work. So I thank the stars for that, and I thank the stars for my mom. She's taught me lots and lots of things. She's taught me how to fold origami paper cranes. They're called tsuru. And I don't do them as well as my mother does. She can make the creases so beautiful, so perfect, so even, so concise. I try my best. I do what I can. Now, the thing about origami paper cranes is that there's another story. And in Japan, if you fold 1,000 of these paper cranes, it's supposed to be for good health. Now, there's a story, which is true, about a little girl who was born around the same time as my mom, maybe a year or two older. She was born in Hiroshima, and her name was Sadako. And when the bomb fell on Hiroshima, she got radiation poisoning. And she developed leukemia because of the radiation poisoning. But in order to restore her health, she continued to fold paper cranes while she was in hospital. And she lived until about age 12, which was when she died. Now, the stories change, right? Stories always change. And it turns out that now when you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you do it for peace. And you do it against war. It's a sort of an anti-war thing. And I remember when I was 17, in 1994, you find out how old I am, my mom and I folded 1,000 paper cranes along with her friends and my friends at school. And we went to Hiroshima, and we strung this huge garland of 1,000 paper cranes, and we left it at the atom bomb memorial in Hiroshima.
Вскоре после боя Илья Алексеевич написал вальс.
My mom taught me how to do other things as well. Lots of things, in fact. And what she taught me was how to make dumplings. I made the dough this morning, and I had to keep it quite in plastic wrap to keep it not from drying out. It's a pretty simple mixture. For those of you who make dumplings or ravioli, it's basically flour, salt, bit of boiling water, you add it, you knead it, you make a dough, you knead it for about 10 minutes, and you roll it out. And then you make these sort of round wrappers And for this particular dumpling, it's called gyoza. And my mom taught me how to make it. You have a mixture of meat, pork mince, cabbage that you wilt, shiitake mushrooms, too, bit of sesame oil, some sake, and that's to mask the odor, bit of salt, bit of rice vinegar, a couple of other things. Ooh, teaspoon of soy sauce. And then you get the meat, you roll it into a ball, you place it in the middle of the dumpling, and then you take your finger in the water and you try and seal the dumpling like this. And the most important part of making a dumpling is, according to my mom, is the folding. And I don't know when I learned how to do this. I probably learned it when I was, I don't know, 7, 8. I don't do it that well, again. Like the origami, I can't do it as well as my mom. If I don't think about it, I make it a bit better, actually. Because I don't think about the creases or the pleats or the folding. I just, my hands know what to do, I think. But again, I mean, they're not as beautiful as the way my mom makes them. So I do what I can, and I do my best. I make them for my family. My son loves them, I think. You're supposed to pan fry them and then steam them. That's what you do with these. And they're great fun to make. The thing about this particular day is that I would have loved to have actually made these for you, to cook them. But of course, due to the regulations, well, we can't do that today. But I can make them. Thing is, my mom was born in a town called Harbin. I'm not sure if you know where this is. She was born there before the end of the war. It's a city in northeastern China, up near the Russian border. It's very cold. It's near Siberia, in a way. And her parents, my grandparents, settled there in the 1920s or the 1930s. My grandmother, Sachiko, was a seamstress. And my grandfather, Isao, played the mandolin. He was an accordionist. He was a bartender. He painted impressionist paintings. He designed matchboxes. And he was a bellboy at a hotel called the Yamato Hotel. The stories from my grandparents I remember growing up, were starry-eyed stories of hanging out and speaking Russian and Japanese and Chinese and English with their international friends in the city of Harbin. They have stories of ice skating on the Sungari River. They have stories of dancing. They have stories about the hotel, the Yamato Hotel, where my grandfather worked. What were they doing there? Well, it has a lot to do with infrastructure. This photo here is an old photo of the railroad station in Harbin. And the railroad station in Harbin was part of the Minami Manshu Tetsudo, which is the South Manchuria Railroad. Originally built by the Russians, and the branch of it was built by the Japanese. Now, they allegedly built the railroad to help, in quotes, the Chinese develop infrastructure. And the Yamato Hotel, where my grandfather worked, was one of 7 Yamato hotels dotted along cities which happened to be on the railroad. The hotels were owned by the railway. Army members would stay there, military members, Japanese military members. And I remember when I was growing up, when I was really little, my grandfather told me a story, and he said in 1931 there was an explosion on the railway. Big explosion. And this happened in a town called Mukden. And the story kind of stayed in my mind, and I don't remember what else he told me about it, but I just remember the story about the explosion on the railway. And only later, much, much later, when I was at school, did I find out that this particular explosion was staged by the Japanese, who blamed it on the Chinese. And that was the justification that the Japanese used to invade this whole region of northeast China. And from then on, that became Manchukuo, the puppet state of Japan, Manchuria. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a performer, so this is interesting for me to be doing. I research people and things that move along roads, along railways. I research air infrastructure as well. And most of the work that I do is actually in the Himalayas, in Tibet, in Northeast India, in Nepal. 2 years ago, I returned to Nepal to do a research project to study with air traffic controllers about the increase in aviation, even in seemingly remote places like the Himalayas. Now, if you recall back in March, pre-COVID, there were a lot of airplanes. And if you thought about aviation, it was growing and growing and growing and growing. It's so much congestion at Schiphol, right? Which is why Lelystad was being sort of built, right? So much congestion in the skies. And this was the topic that I meant to research pre-March. And of course, in Nepal, I was looking at 2 years ago how this was, how this was affecting the aviation industry in Nepal. And in this photo, I'm looking out of the window of a small aircraft, and this is called a twin otter. You can see it about 14 people on a twin otter. And there's a lot of turbulence in the Himalayas, and particularly over the mountains where the weather rolls in, and all of us on this aircraft, everybody was puking. I was like handing out tissues to everybody, and it was quite something. And we were on our way from Kathmandu to a city called Lukla, a small town actually, in the Himalayas. You can Google this too, Lukla. L-U-K-L-A. It's a town in the region of Solukhumbu in Nepal. And when you Google it, the first thing you might see is the world's most dangerous airport. Might not be the world's most dangerous airport. It's kind of dangerous. And the reason why is that when you land into Lukla, you land up a mountain. The runway is approximately 527 meters long, and you stop right at the end of the mountain, going up, right? And it's called a STOL airport, a short takeoff, short landing airport. There's only 4 parking bays. And as soon as you get off this aircraft, 14 more other people are just being rushed on the aircraft. Now, this has to be done quickly because the pilots, actually, they fly by visual flight reference. Visual flight reference means that you don't have instruments on board. You don't necessarily have radar like you do here that where you'd be able to land in clouds. So one thing you need to know when you're flying from Kathmandu to Lukla is how to gauge the weather, which will roll in at 10 or 11 a.m. The wind might go above 10 knots. It's really tricky to land planes manually in places like this. The weather changes so quickly, it really affects the flights. It is, according to the pilots I speak to and the air traffic controllers, a lot of pressure. Before gyoza was gyoza, it was not gyoza. It was jiaozi. And the word jiaozi, a Chinese word, is the same, you use the same characters for gyoza and jiaozi. Jiaozi, gyoza, gyoza, jiaozi. And the best jiaozi is apparently, well, people argue over this, but the best jiaozi is apparently to be found in northeastern China. And the best jiaozi in northeastern China, people may argue, comes from Harbin, the city where my mom was born. 20 years ago, 2000, my sister was studying in Beijing. She wanted to study Chinese, and she had a nice study abroad program, I believe, that she went to in Beijing. And we all wanted to go and visit her, my whole family. So we went to Beijing to visit her. My grandfather in Japan couldn't make it because he was too ill, but me, my mom, my dad, and we went to visit my sister in Beijing. And from Beijing, we decided to take a family pilgrimage to Harbin, up north. And my mom was so excited to go back, to see the Sungari River where her parents ice skated, to see the Yamato Hotel where my grandfather worked, to see the house. Possibly we could find the house where she was born. So all of us went up together, and my sister acted as translator. And when we got there, the memories in her head didn't quite match the reality of Harbin as a city. I mean, what were we thinking? Yeah, in 2000, Harbin is a Chinese city. It's a big, thriving Chinese city, like Chengdu, like other cities in China. It's not quite what she was expecting. You can still see a Russian Orthodox church or two that are there. And we went around trying to find the landmarks of my mom's childhood. We went to the Yamato Hotel, or what it is now. We went to the Sungari River, walked along it, freezing cold, walked along it. And we went around asking people where we could find the house where my mom was born. And my sister, in a very tense moment, had to translate my mom saying, "I was born here. I'm from Japan. I was born here." And then people looked at us and just kind of walked away. I don't know if we all knew. I mean, I knew kind of what this was about. I don't know if my mom or dad knew what this was about, and none of us said anything. And we just kept on asking, and people just walked away. So we found a jiaozi restaurant, and we sat down in what I recall was glum silence, eating our jiaozi. And they were the best dumplings I've ever had in my entire life. In the Himalayas, they're not jiaozi, they're not gyoza, they're momos. And momos are also made in the same way, with a kind of dough like this, filled with meat. But in the Himalayas, usually, depending on where you are, yak meat or buffalo meat. And they're crimped and folded in a bit of a different pattern. Oh, and they're so delicious. They're really delicious. They can either be pan-fried or steamed. The steamed ones are pretty good. Now, in Lukla, I did a lot of research. I spent a lot of time in air traffic control towers. And we ate momos often at 10 or 11 a.m. as the fog rolled in. And the wind goes about above 10 knots. And when it goes above 10 knots, you have to shut the airport. Now imagine if you know people who are really into trekking. You might know people really into trekking, right? People who fly to Lukla, because Lukla is a place that you can fly to in order to trek to Everest Base Camp. So you get these really, really intense people like, we're going to climb Everest. We're going to climb Everest. But we got to do it before our flight leaves in 10 days. And what happens when the weather rolls in? What happens when you have to close the airport? I got stuck in Lukla once for 4 days. Meanwhile, people are looking at their watches saying, we're stuck here, make them fly, make them fly. Now, what you might recall is in 2015, there was an earthquake in Nepal. 2 earthquakes, in fact, and they were terrible. People are still trying to rebuild after the earthquakes. And in some of these regions, tourism is really, really what you kind of depend on. And so, of course, in a way, I suppose you could justify flying people in and out as quickly as possible in tourism season in 2018, because you need to sort of keep the economy afloat in some sort of way, I suppose. So they try and bring in as many flights as they can before the weather gets bad again, because the weather, it's so unpredictable. The weather gets bad really quickly. So sitting in the flight and sitting with the pilots and the air traffic controls in the air traffic control tower, they sit and they look out the window and they go, oh, the weather's bad. They're making us fly again. It's not that safe, is it? When my mom flies, she looks at airplane cutlery. She looks at the paper cups. She looks at me and she sighs. Flying is not like it used to be in the 1970s when she was a flight attendant. The flights are so cramped now, she says. They're so cheap. They cut costs everywhere. The flight attendants are big and they're gruff and they don't even give you water when you ask for water. They're not trained properly now, she says. In Lukla, I also interviewed a group of Nepali flight attendants. I also interviewed groups of Nepali flight attendants in Kathmandu who work for both domestic and international airlines. Now, they tell me that there are two groups of people that they often see flying on their planes. And one group are young Nepali men who live in villages who have never been on planes before, ever. And post-earthquake, there are a lot of villages where there's actually a lot of agriculture, but not so much anymore. People are flying out of villages. And in order to make money, a lot of people are, well, flying, not necessarily flying out of villages, but leaving villages to work in India, to work in other parts of the world, to bring back remittances for their families in the villages. And one place that a lot of these young men go to is the Gulf states. They go to Sharjah, they go to Dubai. They also fly to Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. To do what? To build infrastructure, to build buildings, to do construction, to build infrastructure elsewhere. The roads in their villages may be in disrepair, and it may very well take them 7 hours to get from one village to another in the mountains. Well, it actually takes them more or less the same amount of time to fly to Dubai to work. And these flight attendants who I speak to tell me about these young men who are scared to get on planes, and then they get on the planes to move to a foreign country to work for 2 years or so, building things like the World Cup Stadium in Qatar. And things happen. Some of them don't make it. Some of them come back, but they come back in body bags. And the flight attendants are telling me that that's their job too, is to take the men back to their home villages on planes in the body bags. And they tell me sometimes people just think that all we do is bring body bags back home. There's at least 2 a day. That's part of their job. Their next job is, if they work in domestic airlines that take tourists to trekking areas, well, they've got to move them in and off, on and off the planes quite quickly during a time where the planes, during peak tourist season, for instance. And there are a lot of quick turnarounds in tourist season. And often, everything is so congested in the skies, at least prior to March, that the planes can't land. So if you've ever been in an airplane in the middle of a holding pattern and you have to hold and hold and hold until the plane lands, a lot of that is to do either with weather or congestion, both of which you get a lot of in Kathmandu, if you're flying from Lukla to Kathmandu. And the flight attendants look at me and they say, sometimes when we go back and forth, we don't have the time to go to the toilet. There's no toilets on these small airplanes. And they are stuck in these holding patterns, and they look at me and they laugh and they're like, we have to hold our bladders, holding patterns. Imperialism begins as infrastructure sometimes. For instance, Japanese imperialism with the beginning and the taking over the railroad, there's a thing called a spatial fix. And the spatial fix comes from Marx, taken up by geographer David Harvey. What is the spatial fix? The spatial fix is when you build a fixed structure, like a railroad, for instance, or an airport that's fixed in place in order to move people around, things from point A to point B faster. And the point of this is to increase the turnover time of capital, getting goods and things from point A to point B faster. And sometimes what happens is that when things are a bit, well, when there's a market that's already saturated at point B, what do? You build a point C. You extend your geographical reach so that you can continue to take up space. You continue to build infrastructure to continue to get goods to market. I can quote Harvey, but what this is quote, capitalism's insatiable drive to resolve its inner crisis by geographical expansion. And this is the infrastructure of empire. When we visited Harbin, I don't know if we all knew, but the whole family, there was some confusion. My mom didn't quite understand why people didn't want to discuss the joys of the past of skating on the Skungari River and wonderful memories of her parents and the international city of Harbin. My sister and I didn't really have the heart to say anything about this. We just didn't know, but that's not what you do in our family. All families are different. We don't talk about these things. We just don't talk about them. You don't tell your parents these things. When you make the gyoza dough, you roll and then turn and roll and then turn. And one of the really good tricks of making good round dough is that you don't roll out to the edges. You roll from the middle and then you turn, and you roll in the middle and then you turn. Now, I was born in Michigan, and Michigan is in the shape of a glove, and I was born around here, or right in the middle, in a small town. In America, these are not gyoza, they're not jiaozi, they're not momo, they are pot stickers. And I hate that word. I don't know why. It's a pet peeve of mine. I really don't like the phrase pot stickers. And I think maybe why they're called pot stickers is because they stick to the pot during the pan frying stage of the cooking, something like that. I don't know. But you put enough sesame oil in, they'll never stick to the pot. Anyway, fine. They're called pot stickers in America. In the small town in Michigan, when I was little, there's a song the kids used to sing. And it goes a bit like this. It goes, you put your fingers next to your eyes and you say Chinese, and then you put your fingers down and you say Japanese. Then you point to your knees, you say dirty knees, and you lift up your shirt and you say, look at these. People used to say that around me a lot, quite a lot. But it wasn't as bad as my mom had it. My mom had a lot of things said to her. Again, we don't talk about it, but a lot of things that made me really upset. And the only time my dear dad has ever sworn in his entire life was during one of these incidents. I've never seen him so angry. I've never seen him so angry. When I was 8 in Michigan, there was a kid named Jamie Berger. And Jamie Berger, I think he's on Facebook. I'm sure he's fine. Hi, Jamie Berger. I'm sure you're a decent guy, but I'm going to tell you what happened to me when I was 8 and you were in my class. And if you recall, in Mrs. Hansen, now Mrs. Ware's, 3rd grade class, we studied World War II. And when we learned about Pearl Harbor, Jamie Berger stood up in the middle of the class and pointed at me and said, she did it, Pearl Harbor, she did it, Pearl Harbor, she did it. And I burst out crying. And the thing is, I burst out crying. I don't know why I burst out crying. I just knew I felt like I had to cry. And the teacher was nice about it and took me in a corner and said, oh, sorry about Jamie Berger. I just didn't know what that was all about, really, I think. It's hard to remember. So there's one Chinese restaurant in town, in the town that we were we were living in. And we used to love to go there. My mom was so happy, finally Asian food after all this like American Western like stuff. Finally, dumplings, finally proper food. And we really liked the owners and the owners liked us. And when we went to Bamboo Garden, the name of the Chinese restaurant, what was on the menu? Pot stickers. But when we ordered, we would always order jiaozi or gyoza. We would use the terms interchangeably. We would never, ever, ever use the word pot stickers. People and things need to be moved in order to make more space and often more money. And in order to do this, sometimes you need something fixed in place in order for things to move, in order for things to move faster, in order to increase the turnover time of capital, I suppose, like imperial railroads, like getting my grandparents and countless numbers of Japanese over to Manchuria, like air traffic routes in the sky, or like getting Nepali villagers to fly out of their villages to the Gulf states in order to build the World Cup Stadium in Qatar. Building infrastructure elsewhere. The US has a lot of military bases in Okinawa, China's terraforming islands. There's also the Belt and Road Initiative, where technically now you can go from Madrid to Beijing overland. There's also the maritime version of this as well. It's improving connections, no? Territorial expansion, though, extends upwards, it extends in the air, extends out to sea, across land. It can also fold in on itself. And you know what you can do? You can separate airspace sectors into more sectors in order to fit more planes in the sky. And did you know, you probably know this already, I suppose, but when you fold origami and when you fold things, you create more surface area. And they say also, if you fold dumplings the right way, if you get the creases just right, it'll seal in more flavor. I love my mom, if that's not clear yet. She's really brave, she's really cool, she can do everything. She's taught me so much. Everybody should meet her. I think I said earlier that we don't talk about these things in my family. And my mom asked me, will this performance be recorded? And I said, yeah, I can't wait to see it. And I mentioned we don't talk about these things in my family. We don't. So maybe this is it. Maybe this is how we start the conversation.